Hey everybody, welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. In honor of Women's History Month, today we're going to be talking about Pamela Colman Smith, the woman who illustrated the tarot deck that you are probably working with, that I've definitely referenced on this podcast, and if you're working with a deck that's not the Rider-Waite Smith deck, there's a high probability that your deck was inspired by her deck. In fact, unless you're working with the Thoth deck, the Hermetic deck, or something that's explicitly modeled on one of those, I can almost guarantee that your deck is based on the Rider-Waite Smith deck. This goes for just about everything, whether that's a really abstract deck, the modern witch deck that looks fairly similar to your Rider-Waite Smith, and even ones like the pasta deck and the cat deck and the dog deck. All these decks were inspired by hers because hers really set the baseline for what we expect a tarot deck to look like. It was also the first illustrated deck in modern times. It's a common misconception that she was the first one to illustrate the minor arcana, but this actually isn't true. The very first deck to have an illustrated minor arcana is known as the Solabusca Tarot, which I might share some images of on Instagram or perhaps talk a bit about more in a future episode, but today we're going to be solely focused on Pamela Colman Smith and how she changed tarot decks with her illustrations of the Rider-Waite Smith deck. Now, just to backtrack a bit, the Solabusca Tarot was illustrated in 1491, and it had a bunch of illustrated minor arcana, or pips as they're often known. And Pamela Colman Smith drew quite a bit of inspiration from the Solabusca deck. A copy of it is owned by the British Museum, and in 1908 there was a photographic exhibition of the cards, and that's where Pamela Colman Smith saw the deck. So if you were wondering how somebody in an era without Google searches was able to take a look at this tarot deck that was a couple hundred years old at that point, that's how. Pamela Colman Smith's name was left off of her tarot deck, which I guess you could make the argument that it was more so Arthur Waite's tarot deck, which I'll explain more in a few, but her name was left off of this deck, the deck that she illustrated for decades. That's why it was known as the Rider-Waite deck for such a long time. And there was a concerted movement to start referring to it as the Rider-Waite Smith deck or even the Waite Smith deck. And I'm really happy to see that that's caught on and that most people are calling it some variation of the name that includes hers in it right now, because she is the artist. She's the one who created it. Now, the reason why I say you could potentially make an argument to say it's a little more of Arthur Waite's brainchild than hers is that he's the one who had the vision for a new tarot deck and one that updated imagery and really brought tarot to modern audiences. He commissioned it from Pamela Colman Smith. I don't think that in any way undermines her contribution, but it was his idea and she brought it to life. Now, you might be wondering, well then who was Rider? Well, Rider was just the publisher. Rider was the esoteric publisher in London at the time, known as Rider & Son, who published the tarot deck and also other metaphysical and mystical texts. Now, who was Arthur Waite? Arthur Waite, known as AE Waite, was a poet, mystic, and writer who lived in England in the second half of the 19th century, and he was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is where he met Pamela Colman Smith. We're going to circle back to him in a little bit when he enters her story, but as I mentioned, this episode is about her, not about him. And if it feels relevant, maybe I'll do an episode about him down the line, but he's been taking credit for her work for a long, long, long time, and he does not need to be being the focus of this podcast. So, without further ado, let's talk a bit about Pamela Colman Smith. Pamela Colman Smith, also known as Pixie, was born in 1878. She was born in London to American parents, and throughout her childhood, she and her family spent time in both New York City and Jamaica. She was actually inspired quite a bit by Jamaican folklore, and you can see this influence in her art. You can also see influences from European fairy tales and folklore in her art, and then later in life, she became very interested in particularly Irish folklore and fairy tales, not like Hansel and Gretel, but literally the kind that involve fairies. So that's kind of cool to see how her art evolved even after the tarot deck, because it's perhaps the thing she's best known for today, or what am I even saying? I think it is the thing she's best known for today. But it wasn't her magnum opus or her primary life's work. She was an accomplished artist before and after this tarot deck came out, and in fact, it was kind of a gig for her. I think that when I was researching this episode, that was one thing that I found one of the most interesting was I guess I just assumed you create the world's most iconic tarot deck. That's going to be kind of your main life's work, right? Your magnum opus? But the reality was, it was a gig for her. It was a freelance opportunity that she was paid, as she put it, a nominal amount for. And she actually produced it pretty quickly. I want to say it was like a 6-month time frame between being commissioned and delivering all 78 images back to Arthur Waite to go be published as the Rider-Waite deck. I just think that's wild and fascinating. Like, think about that. This deck that you're working with and influenced by, and we're poring over all this deep symbolism and debating, all right, well, what's the deal with the figure 4 pose that the Hanged Man has? And is it actually the same pose as the Woman on the World? And what does that mean? And we're just pulling down and boring deep into all things like color choices and the direction people are looking. And she produced it rather quickly. Lickety-split. I thought that was pretty fascinating to learn. I actually learned a lot of fascinating things about her and the deck and how it was received in its early days from researching this episode. So how did Pamela Colman Smith become an artist? Here's how. At age 15, Pamela Colman Smith came to New York City to study at the Pratt Institute. For those who aren't familiar, the Pratt Institute is a world-renowned art college, and it's still there today. She didn't end up graduating, but that's alright, she's an important alumna. But the Pratt Institute proudly displayed her work. In 2019, I was fortunate enough to go see a lot of her work on display at the Pratt Institute. It's in Brooklyn, and if you go there, I don't think her work is on display now, but there's so much other cool art there. It really is a cool place to walk around and check out, both inside the galleries and on the grounds. The Institute doesn't actually own her work, though, at least not all of it, and this is an issue that I ran into when I was researching this, because I wanted to know, where is Pamela Colman Smith's work today? And the unfortunate answer is, we don't know. For most of it. We know where some of it is, and we know a lot of it is held by private owners. Unfortunately, when I saw her work in 2019, I didn't actually see who it was on loan from, so I'm not quite sure. And I also know that in 2022, her work was on display at the Whitney Museum of Art in New York City, so it seems like a good chunk of her work lives in or near New York City. I think I read that some of it is owned by the Stieglitz Gallery. She actually did display some work at Alfred Stieglitz's gallery in 1907 and a bit later, and I think that's another cool little anecdote we're going to get into. But unfortunately, at the end of her life, a lot of her work was sold to satisfy her outstanding debts. What wasn't sold went to Nora Lake, her longtime flatmate and possibly, but not officially confirmed, romantic partner. The two of them lived together for decades, and I think we can likely say that they were partners, but we don't know that for sure. So who was she during her life? She was in the bohemian scene. She was an artist. She rubbed elbows and ran in the same circles with Bram Stoker and W.B. Yeats. She did stagecraft. She designed sets, and you can see that influence in some of her tarot work. You can also see some Art Nouveau influence in her work, which I think is just lovely. And then when you go and look at paintings and drawings that she did that aren't part of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, you can absolutely see her clearly defined distinctive style. Also, if you take a look on the cards, you'll notice her signature is on every single one of them except the Fool. And it's speculated that it got cropped out on the Fool, that the Fool original image might have been a bit larger but cropped to fit a tarot card size. And so we ended up with a Fool that doesn't feature her signature. However, you can see it on all the rest of them. In some, it's really, really difficult to see because it might be against a dark background or worked into the image in some way, but it looks like a vertical line with a squiggly line kind of wrapped around it, like a caduceus. So take a look on that. It's a fun little thing. A lot of people ask me, what is that design on these cards? And I tell them, it's Pamela Colman Smith's signature. Pamela Colman Smith is also famous for being the artist behind the first non-photographic exhibition at Alfred Stieglitz's gallery. At the time, he displayed all photographs, but had the idea to display art that could show what photography could not do. And we saw Pamela Colman Smith's mystical, dreamy, very, I don't want to say abstract, but definitely dreamlike imagery displayed there to, well, showcase, well, what can't photography do? And it was that. It couldn't create the dreamscapes that she could create. I think it's also important to take a look at Pamela Colman Smith's spiritual life, because it was eclectic. She was raised in the religion of the New Church, or Swedenborgianism, and that's a type of Christianity that the primary tenet is that salvation comes through an understanding of divine truths in your inner self. I don't want to go too super deep into this here because we could talk about Swedenborgianism for hours. That's, like any other religion, it's dense, it's layered, it's nuanced. But kind of the long and short of it is that instead of being saved through faith alone or through good works, the whole point is this sense of enlightenment, this idea that your inner self, your soul, so to speak, needs to accept truths that come directly from God, and you need to basically understand and converse with God. Later, she became more involved in the esoteric and mystical worlds, and that's where she entered the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and met Arthur Waite. But her spiritual development didn't stop there. Later on, she converted to Catholicism, and she remained a devout Catholic for the rest of her life, until her death in 1951. Bringing it back to her involvement with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, sources vary on when she joined. She might have joined in 1901, she might have joined in 1903. I don't think it really makes that huge of a difference, only when you take a look at the timeline of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, you can see that she joined pretty late in its life. It was perhaps kind of on the downswing by the time she came on board, so I'm not sure what that meant day to day for members, but the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was a secret society that operated in London from 1887 to 1903. Its members were interested in all things mystical and esoteric, all the witchy, otherworldly, supernatural stuff that probably a lot of you listening are interested in as well. But to get a little more specific, they were interested in Hermeticism. I think it's important to understand the mindset, the practices, and the perspectives of what she and Arthur Waite were involved in when they were designing this tarot deck. Hermeticism, also known as Hermetism, is a religious and philosophical tradition that dates back to the Hellenistic period in ancient Greece. This period was about 323 BCE to 30 BCE. It was also the period between the death of Alexander the Great and the death of Cleopatra VII. So just to drop you into history, that's when this philosophy first emerged. Hermeticism, also known as Hermetism, is named for the mythological figure of Hermes Trismegistus, who is a character, not a real person, although some throughout history have believed that he was a real person. He really wasn't. You kind of have to understand how these philosophical texts were largely written in those days. They were often allegorical and often written as conversations between figures, possibly between a literal human and a mythological figure, or a divine figure, or even a conversation between two figures. And that's really the tradition that we find this original Hermetism springing out of. So Hermes Trismegistus is an example of syncretism. Syncretism is the combining of two disparate religious or cultural traditions. In his case, it was the combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. You've seen examples of syncretism before. Think about how every holiday season there's memes that go all over social media that are like, you know that Christmas tree that you put your presents under? That's a pagan tradition. Well, it's true, that actually is an example of syncretism, where different cultures, as they merge, adopt traits and adopt traditions from each other to, on the one hand, make things more palatable for the different people who are now coming together and really adapting their ways of lives, and also to preserve traditions. The Christmas tree is probably one of the best known examples of syncretism, but another that I thought was pretty cool was how Samhain got adopted into Hallowtide, which was a long-standing Christian tradition of 3 days of Halloween, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day. I know in modern America, at least, we don't really think of Halloween as a 3-day festival, but in earlier Christian traditions, that's what this was. It was this time period to reflect on the ending, the beginning, mortality, and honor those who have died. You see that in a bunch of traditions. You see it in Dia de los Muertos, this time frame of this is we're honoring our ancestors and we're leaving offerings for them and ensuring that their memory stays alive. That was an ancient Celtic tradition. That was Samhain. That was the time of year when the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest, and it was most easy to communicate with those who've passed on. So in this time frame where Hellenistic Greece was making inroads in Egypt and combining with Egyptian culture and politics and people, we saw quite a bit of syncretism between Egyptian and Greek traditions. That's the place and time and circumstances in history that we get Hermeticism from. Now, Hermeticism itself is the entire worldview and philosophy that came out of the writings known as the Hermetica, which are the writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. These writings covered everything from astrology to alchemy to pharmacology to medicine to magic. They covered the whole gamut. But overall, one of their primary tenets was the drive to live a lifestyle that leads to a spiritual rebirth. It was essentially to live like Hermes, to model oneself on what are the principles that guided Hermes and how did he embrace spiritual rebirth. And I think that knowing that this is the groundwork for Hermeticism, the very ancient philosophy that Pamela Colman Smith was involved with and studying, really gives us some interesting context for the Fool's Journey. I think it also provides some explanation for why we see so much Egyptian imagery in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Well, now we know Hermeticism was something that arose in Egypt, and a lot of the Hermetica was quite likely written by the Egyptian priest class. So that's where Pamela Colman Smith was spiritually, philosophically, and socially in her 20s when she was asked to draw the tarot deck. So how did she get commissioned to draw the tarot deck? Well, we're going to take a look at that right now. Arthur, more commonly known as AE Waite, was a poet, mystical scholar, and author of texts on divination, Kabbalism, esotericism, and related topics. In 1909, he commissioned Pamela Colman Smith to illustrate a tarot deck. This deck would be wildly different from the decks that were used for divination at the time, which were typically playing cards or more of a Marseille-style deck. If you want to learn more about reading Marseille-style decks and reading playing cards, and in doing that, getting an understanding of what tarot card reading was like in these earlier days, check out the episode I did about reading playing cards. Waite is largely credited with providing the artistic direction for the designs. Smith then took his instructions and ran with them. That's how she created the deck. According to legend, she had quite a bit of artistic freedom when it came to the minor arcana, mostly because she didn't really have a whole lot to draw from. She knew what each card needed to represent, but she didn't have an existing deck, aside from those photos of the Solabusca Tarot, to really draw inspiration from, in the sense of like, well, how do I illustrate this specific idea? However, with the major arcana, she did have cards to pull inspiration from. The major arcana from all those existing Marseille-style decks. We're also going to see ways that Waite and Smith changed these cards, because they did make a couple of important changes. If you've been listening along through Season 1, there's a couple of points where I point out how our Rider-Waite-Smith deck deviates from a Marseille-style deck. Perhaps the most notable example is how the Lovers changed. Previously, the Lovers did not look like two nude figures standing with some trees that represent different elements underneath an angel. It was one man with two women standing under an angel, and the implication was more so that he needs to choose between them, and there was more of this idea of, who are you partnering with? What choices are you going to make in this regard? But then Waite, partially because he wanted to make it more aligned with the astrological associations that the Society of the Golden Dawn made between the tarot cards, he decided to switch up this design and make them look more like Adam and Eve. He wanted to emphasize that idea that the Lovers is associated with the sign Gemini, and thought that making it a card primarily featuring these two figures together would be a clearer way to communicate that. He also incorporated, or gave Smith artistic direction to incorporate, more Christian imagery, and in some cases, to reduce some Christian imagery. It's kind of interesting. We saw points where more Christian and Judaic and from other religions imagery got worked into the deck. Like we have on the Ace of Cups, we now have what appears to be the host with a dove and the chalice, so it's very reminiscent of this idea of communion and peace and everything that comes with that. There are also cases where imagery was made less overtly Christian, such as where he changed the papess to the high priestess. Now, of course, a priestess is still a very religious figure, but she was previously a lot more overtly linked with the Pope. Going back to that connection that Waite wanted to build between the astrological correspondences that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn taught about and this new deck, they actually reversed the order of justice and strength, so that's why we see them in that order. Originally, strength was in number 11 and justice was in number 8, but to make them fit that linear progression of the zodiac signs, Arthur Edward Waite had them flip-flopped, so now they are where they are, because strength is correlated with Leo and justice with Libra, respectively. And that actually brings us to one of the greatest criticisms of this deck, this idea that Arthur Waite moved around a bunch of things to fit his worldview and his ideas, and that the deck combines a whole mishmash of different illusions and symbols from all different cultures without really one coherent idea. It's kind of like we want something from Judeo-Christian tradition over here, we want something from Greek tradition over there, we want something Egyptian, and then we want to throw in some astrology. That's a totally valid critique. It's one I've heard quite a bit, and it's one that some tarot purists, primarily someone who might opt for more of a Marseille-style, or those who really love the Thoth deck, have lobbied against the Rider-Waite-Smith that, hey, it's kind of all over the place with its symbolism. And yeah, it is. We see Hebrew text on a number of cards. We see the ibis, that Greek and Egyptian reference to the idea of wisdom over on the star. We see references to the Pleiades. We see references to the 12 zodiac signs. We even see that inverted pentagram on the devil that speaks to paganism and Wicca, although at the time when this deck was published, there was no Wicca. The deck and its accompanying guidebook, The Pictorial Key to the Tarot, were published in 1910. I actually have a copy of this book, and it is dense and kind of dry, but I think it's a worthwhile read, especially if you want to know what Arthur Edward Waite was thinking when he commissioned this deck. One thing that kind of surprised me was that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence for Pamela Colman Smith using this deck for divination purposes. As I mentioned, she was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and I think we can safely surmise that plenty of divination was going on in that group. I mean, the guy commissioned a tarot deck, and that's what these people did. But there isn't a whole lot of evidence to support that Pamela Colman Smith was really that committed of a member. In fact, quite the opposite. We know she didn't go very far in her studies, and maybe it's because she entered the order fairly late in its life, or maybe because spiritually she was going in another direction. As far as whether it was a spiritual practice or merely a philosophical and intellectual or even just a social one for her, we do know that she started embracing Catholicism shortly after leaving the Golden Dawn, or after it kind of collapsed around her. By 1911, I think that was when she made her full conversion to Catholicism, and whether she continued to promote her tarot deck or take credit for it for the rest of her life, that part, I don't know. We don't know. She actually died pretty much in obscurity, which I think, as a tarot card reader, it's kind of wild to think about when you think about just how much influence she's had on what we do. How many millions of copies of this deck have been sold and are in pockets and on bookshelves and getting used every single day, even right now. Without her, it's quite likely that you would be reading a much more Marseille-style deck. You would be doing a lot more memorizing of numerical and suit correspondences. Or maybe you'd be reading with the Thoth deck, the first edition of which came out in the late 1930s. Possibly. And maybe the entire world's relationship with tarot would be very different. I'll tell you what we wouldn't have. We wouldn't have that Led Zeppelin album cover with the hermit on it, because, well, if she hadn't illustrated it, what else would they have put on there? Maybe it's a whole butterfly effect, and maybe they would have put the Thoth hermit. I don't know. But I do think that without this softer, brighter, more colorful, and more widely appealing interpretation of the tarot, I do think there would be far fewer tarot card readers today. I wonder how many there would be. Would I be a tarot card reader? Would you? I don't know. I think I'd still be an astrologer. But that about sums up our story of Pamela Colman Smith and how she influenced the modern tarot deck. Next time you pull some cards, thank her. And I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope you learned something valuable. I know I certainly did. And if you like what you heard, subscribe, if you're not subscribed already. It's super easy, and when you subscribe, you get notified every single time a new episode drops. I've got some really cool things in the works for the next couple of weeks, so definitely stay tuned. As always, if you'd like to reach out to me directly, you can shoot me an email at omg@omgtarot.com, or find me on Instagram, where my handle is its_omg_tarot. Alright, it's been a lot of fun. Talk soon. Bye-bye.